Okay, Gordon, thank you very much. That's a very good point about the idea of the extent to which immigration is in fact an issue in this constitutional debate in Scotland, and that's potentially quite different from UK politics. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that point in a moment. So just give an outline of the talk this afternoon. First of all, I'll talk about the issue of immigration and how it is potentially significant or otherwise in the independence debate in Scotland. So I'll focus most of my attention on public attitudes towards immigration in Scotland and how they might be related to the issue of constitutional change in Scotland. However, I think it's important not to just get caught up on what the public thinks. Other voices obviously influence immigration policy, so I'll talk about that quite briefly. And to sum up, I'll try and think about what sort of opportunities and challenges are there for a more independent immigration policy in Scotland, regardless of the outcome of the vote in September. Okay. First point is that Scotland is quite often presented as being exceptional in terms of immigration, and this exceptionality argument is used to support the idea that Scotland is deserving and merits a separate and distinctive immigration policy. So the first thing to do is to look at some of those claims of exceptionality. Three aspects of it. There's patterns, perceptions, and policies. Starting off with patterns, there certainly is a good case to argue that Scotland is in some ways exceptional in terms of experiences of immigration. Historically, as I'm sure you are aware, Scotland has tended to lose more people than it has gained through migration. It's only in the last few decades that that's been turned around. So historically, Scotland has been a country of emigration rather than immigration. And as a consequence, Scotland's immigrant population is a lot smaller than the UK's. It's half that of England, for example. And because of lower fertility rates in Scotland and a more rapidly ageing population structure, it's fairly well accepted that migration is to some extent key to sustaining and growing Scotland's population, at least in the short and medium terms. So Scotland's distinct in some ways in terms of patterns. In terms of perceptions, there's a quite widespread idea that Scotland is in some ways more welcoming, or at least less hostile to immigration than is the case in the UK generally, and that's what I'll discuss this afternoon. And finally, policies. Scotland has a very different outlook towards immigration than is the case at Westminster. So in Scotland, we've had a population target for quite some time, whereas UK government has got a migration cap. So very different perspectives. And of course, these different perspectives have implications for the referendum debate. Okay, what sort of immigration policy can Scotland have in the future? Just a little bit of background then. As I said, the Scottish government and the UK government have got very different outlooks in terms of immigration policy. Since 2007, the Scottish government has had a population target which aims to match population growth in Scotland with the European Union 15 countries average over the period 2007 to 2017. And at least in the short term, migration is the way to achieve this. Migration has been portrayed as key not only to demographic stability and growth, but also economic growth. And as such, the Scottish Government has tried to attract so-called new Scots to come to and settle in Scotland. UK government policy, very different, especially since 2010 with the Conservative-led government. Policy rhetoric has becoming much more negative about immigration, and actual immigration policy has become more restrictive since 2010. A good example is the migration cap, which was set out whenever the Conservative-led government came into office. And the idea here was that they would cut net migration to the UK to less than 100,000 per year at the time of the next election. The next election, as I'm sure you're aware, is in May, and they're nowhere near to meeting that target, so we haven't really heard so much about the migration cap recently. But that just sort of illustrates some of the very different positions at Holyrood and at Westminster in terms of immigration policy. Why does this matter? Because as things currently stand, the immigration system and border controls are reserved to Westminster. So the Scottish Government may wish to attract migrants to Scotland, but it doesn't have the policy levers to do that. The noises coming from Holyrood are very different from Westminster. In Holyrood, we've got a broad political consensus that immigration is a good thing. And again, that's very different from noises coming from London. So what are the positions in the referendum debate? Starting off with the yes camp. In the White Scotland's Future White Paper, the Scottish Government argued that Scotland's needs for migration were different to the rest of the UK, and that Scotland's migration priorities weren't served by the one-size-fits-all UK immigration policy. So they put forward a number of proposals in the white paper. These include a reconfigured points-based system towards, for example, Scottish salary levels, a restoration of the post-work study visa, a more humane asylum system, and the idea that migration, free movement of people within the European Union would continue in an independent Scotland. Interestingly and critically, they also argued that Scotland would remain the part of the common travel area, which allows free movement between UK and Ireland. That would continue with independence. And the white paper also argues that independent Scotland would avoid having to join the Schengen area, which would mean that third country nationals within Europe wouldn't have access to Scotland. Okay? As we might expect, some of these proposals have been critiqued by the No camp. Some of these arguments come from the Scotland analysis papers out by the Treasury. They argue that management of a single international border is to the benefit of the whole of the UK. They take issue with the idea that Scotland could have an independent immigration policy, but at the same time remain within the common travel area. So they say that Scotland's immigration policy would have to be very much closely aligned to the UK's immigration policy if it wanted to stay in the common travel area and have that free movement of people. They warn that negotiations regarding entry to the European Union would involve Scotland having to sign up to the Schengen Area Agreement. That would rule them out of being part of the CTA, and they also raise the issue of possible border controls between Scotland and the rest of the UK and Ireland. Okay? And finally, they do concede that Scotland has a greater need for migration because of its more rapidly ageing population structure. However, they argue that immigration isn't necessarily the answer to that problem. First of all, we would need quite substantial inflows to address the issue of population ageing, and even if those big inflows were achieved, this would cause problems in terms of infrastructure, public services, and also social cohesion. So quite different perspectives, as we might expect from the yes and the no camps. Okay? But as Gordon pointed out a moment ago, immigration isn't necessarily the biggest issue in the referendum debate. It hasn't been mentioned so far today, so I'm quite pleasantly surprised you've asked me to speak about it today, which is nice. But if you ask people, this is a poll from the BBC earlier this year, ask people the issues which are going to determine how they will vote next month. And we see that only 6% of respondents mentioned immigration as being the key factor which is going to determine their choice in the referendum. Okay? 1 in 5 voters in Scotland ranked it as one of their top 3 issues. But as you can see, it's nowhere near the key issue, which is going to determine how people vote. Okay? So it matters to about maybe 20% of the population see it as a big issue, but hardly any see it as the key issue facing Scotland. If we compare this to the UK level, a poll out last month, immigration and race issues are consistently the top or else the second top issue which the UK electorate sees as the top issues facing the country. Okay? And some of the newspaper headlines, you can see that immigration is an issue which is never far away from the headlines, at the UK level at least. And also, in an international context, the UK immigration does seem to occupy the public's mind and imagination much more in the UK than it does in other countries as well. Okay? So that's quite interesting in the referendum debate because it's hardly an issue in Scotland in terms of the vote next month, but at the UK level, politics is a much bigger issue. So the main focus of the talk is looking at the link between public opinion in Scotland and how people will vote in the referendum. Just before I talk about the more recent research, I'll just summarise some of the things we already know about immigration and attitudes to immigration in Scotland. It matters because the premise of the Scottish Government and having a more liberal immigration policy is that this would be supported by the people who actually vote for independence. So it's worth looking at the extent to which there's a gap between the very positive rhetoric from political elites in Scotland and actually what the public thinks on the ground. In terms of existing research, social survey data sets like the SSA and also smaller scale case study research seems to at least support the idea that Scotland is to some extent less hostile to immigration than other parts of Britain. And various social scientists have tried to put forward ideas for why this might be the case. All perfectly sensible ideas. First of all, there's the idea that Scotland has experienced less immigration than other parts of the UK, hence less hostility to immigration. However, it's not necessarily a straightforward correlation between volume of inflows and hostility. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Another very sensible proposition is that in Scotland, articulations of Scottish identity and Scottish nationalism have been much more civic-minded and therefore inclusionary than ethnic-based nationalism, which is much more exclusionary of immigrants and other. There's also the idea that political leadership on the issue of immigration in Scotland has been much stronger. So there's a consensus in Scotland amongst politicians that immigration isn't this scary big thing that's going to overrun the country. And finally, media discourses about immigration seem to be much more positive in Scotland than is the case at the UK level. So those are some of the reasons why the public in Scotland might be less hostile to immigration than is the case in the UK level. However, it's not necessarily all a rosy story. Recent research carried out by the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford found that most people in Scotland actually do want to see reductions in immigration, and only 14% of the population in Scotland want the Scottish Government to take up a more liberal immigration policy than is the case at UK level. Okay, so this kind of matters because the assumption is that with independence, the Scottish Government would seek to enact a more liberal immigration policy. There's also concern that in Scotland, resentment does exist and prejudice does exist, but tends to be directed towards perhaps English residents as opposed to international migrants. And this has implications for the referendum debate as well, because if Scotland were to become independent, the 10% of its population who are born in the rest of the UK would technically become immigrants as well. So Scotland would suddenly have quite a large immigrant population. Okay, so looking at more recent data, what I've tried to do is look at two questions. How do attitudes towards immigration in Scotland compared to other parts of the UK? And secondly, what is the nature of the relationship between constitutional preference and how you feel about immigration? Okay, we use the British Social Attitudes Survey, the most recent edition, which is publicly available, and we compare attitudes in Scotland versus different regions in England. With the Scottish Social Attitudes Survey, there haven't been many recent questions about immigration, so for that reason we're restricted to older editions. So some of the data from the SSA isn't quite up to date. I'll elaborate on that in a moment. Okay, so headline figures. The most recently available data from the British Social Attitudes Survey points to the picture of Scotland being less hostile than other places, but only slightly so. Okay, so I don't know if everyone can read this. The blue bars are the proportion of people who say that immigration should be reduced a lot. So Scotland's the second place along there, and in Scotland about 45% of the population agrees with the statement that immigration should be reduced a lot. That is lower than most other places, apart from outer London. Okay. Similarly, with the second statement, this is the proportion of the population who agree strongly that Britain would begin to lose its identity if more Muslims came to live in Britain. Okay. Scotland, about maybe 27% agree with that statement. Again, that's lower than most other places apart from inner London. And finally, one of the questions in the British Social Attitudes Survey asked people the extent to which they are prejudiced or very prejudiced against people of other races. Quite a lot of people actually say yes to this question, surprisingly so. Scotland doesn't perform particularly well in this indicator. About a third about 30% of the population describe themselves as prejudiced against people of other races. Okay, this is pretty similar to most other parts of the UK, apart from the southeast. Okay, so in these indicators, Scotland does seem to be slightly less hostile to immigration, but only slightly so. Okay, and there's some worrying indicators here if you're trying to promote a more liberal immigration policy in Scotland. Okay, so looking in more detail about attitudes towards immigration within Scotland, we turn to the Scottish Social Attitudes Survey because it's got a much larger sample within Scotland, and we can compare change over time, and we can look at the relationship between attitude towards immigration and attitude towards constitutional preference. Looking at economic indicators of the impact of immigration, about a third of the population would agree that ethnic minorities take jobs away from Scotland, and there seems to be increasing belief and support for this view over time. Okay, so overall, more people disagree with the statement than agree with it, but maybe opposition on economic grounds to immigration is increasing over time. It's increased from 1 in 5 in 2002 to 1 in 3 in 2010. Another indicator asks people about sort of the cultural impact of immigration. So we see that about nearly half of the population in Scotland would agree that Black and Asian ethnic minorities, Eastern Europeans or Muslims would pose a threat to Scotland's national identity, okay? So about half the population voicing those concerns. But of course, what we're probably most interested in today is the relationship between these sort of views and constitutional preference, okay? And this is what we find. Again, the health warning is that this comes from 2010. Things have changed since 2010. But what we see is that people who support independence are more likely to agree with the statement that ethnic minorities take jobs away from other people in Scotland. Okay? So according to this data, there isn't necessarily support for the people who support independence don't necessarily support the premise that Scotland would enact a more liberal immigration policy. Okay? However, the health warning comes from this, that it's in 2010. So what I've done is I've found some other data sources. And this chart comes from research from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, which was conducted much more recently. However, their survey methods probably weren't as rigorous as the SS, Scottish Social Attitudes Survey. But here we go, this is what they found. They found the inverse of the last chart. Here we see overall constitutional preference, big support, big advantage for the no group. However, when we cross-tabulate that against whether you want a reduction in immigration or you don't want a reduction in immigration, people who don't want the reduction in immigration, the lead for the no camp evaporates to a large extent. Whereas people who do want a big reduction in immigration, the no group's far way ahead. Okay? So based on this evidence, we would say people who will vote no in the referendum are more opposed to immigration. Okay? And finally, some more research up to date. This is research commissioned by the University of Stirling towards the end of last year. And they asked people what they think would happen to immigration in the event of independence and whether these changes would be a good thing or a bad thing. So there's quite a lot going on in this chart. But I suppose the messages are that the two shades of red indicate immigration being a bad thing, and the two shades of green mean that immigration is seen as a good thing. Okay? So amongst people who will vote for independence, about a third of them see immigration as a bad thing. However, much more of them see immigration as being a good thing than is the case with the no camp. Okay? So just to summarise in terms of public opinion, within Scotland, there's less hostility to immigration than other parts of the UK, but only slightly so. There's some indications of hostility to immigration and concerns that this is maybe increasing over time. Concerns about immigration based on the SSA data suggest that concerns are more culturally based than economically based on economic indicators. And finally, within the referendum, there's some conflicting evidence, but we can tentatively say that maybe independent supporters are more tolerant of immigration than is the case amongst people who support staying within the UK. However, I mentioned at the beginning that when we think about immigration policy, it's not just what the public wants, which matters. Immigration policy, as is the case with all types of policy, involves compromises between economic factors, political factors, and other factors as well. Immigration policy is no different. What we see in Scotland, UK, European countries, many other countries, is public hostility to immigration. However, immigration policies are usually much more liberal than the public would like. In social science, we call this public opinion gap, whereby immigration policy is more liberal than the electorate would like it to be. Okay? So this has implications for Scotland as well, because if the Scottish Government had the powers to enact its own immigration policy, it would face pressure from the public potentially to restrict immigration, but it would face influences from other factors, other voices, to create a different immigration policy. So business, of course, quite often pushes for more liberal immigration policies. So we see a situation where businesses aren't particularly happy with immigration policy because it's not as liberal as they would like it to be, and we see the public not happy with immigration policy because they see it as being too liberal. And governments have to try and weigh up and compromise between these two different voices. And that's a choice which the Scottish Government hasn't had to make yet because it doesn't have the powers to do so, but would have to do so coming into the future. And of course, local government's an interesting scale of governance as well, because the Scottish Government makes very positive noises about immigration, tries to increase immigration, whereas it's actually local governments which deal with the effects of immigration on the ground. So over the last 6 months, 12 months, we've been conducting research with local government in Scotland and with businesses in Scotland. And I don't have time to talk about what they said, but I'm happy to answer some questions about that towards the end. Okay, so the implications for the referendum debate are that there's all sorts of competing influences on immigration policy. The Scottish Government hasn't had the powers, so it hasn't had to make these difficult choices yet, but that's something we need to consider going into the future. Okay, so just to sum up, it's probably fair to say that there is an element of distinctiveness in Scotland in relation to immigration. That refers to the experiences of immigration in the past, how Scotland is perceived, and of course, the policies which the Scottish Government would like to enact in terms of immigration. Relevance to the referendum debate is that based on this analysis, it's fairly legitimate to promote Scotland as being a relatively welcoming place for migrants compared to other parts of the UK, certainly. And in that case, in that sense, it's legitimate to try and enact policies to attract so-called new Scots to Scotland. However, these sort of proposals would potentially face some significant opposition, including from the very people who would vote for independence in the first place. As I said, immigration hasn't been the central battleground in this debate, but it may become more of an issue in the future if Scotland does have the powers to enact its own immigration policy, and if immigration numbers actually rise into the future. And of course, it's not just about what the public thinks, the political economy of immigration policy is very important as well. Okay, so just one last slide. I promised at the beginning that I'm trying to think about what sort of immigration policy Scotland might have going forward into the future. And there are various opportunities and challenges for Scotland, regardless of what happens next month. Okay, so if the opinion polls are correct, and Scotland does vote no and stays in the UK, there are some opportunities for Scotland to develop immigration measures which are well attuned to its needs within the broader UK framework. So we see in countries such as Canada and Australia so-called subnational immigration policies which allow for immigration to particular parts of a country within a broader national framework. Okay? So potentially that could be applied to Scotland. However, the warning is that there's certainly practical barriers to that. People might move to Scotland and head south, and there are political barriers to it as well. If there's a no vote, it's probably unlikely, given the rhetoric around immigration, that Westminster would agree to Scotland having more measures to try and attract migrants to the country. So if there's a no vote, the chances are that Scotland will probably remain bound to the one-size-fits-all UK-wide immigration policy. However, that's not to say that everything will be fine with independence. Okay, if there's a yes vote, Scotland, in theory, will have the policy levers to enact its own immigration policy. And you could argue that there's relative public support for a more liberal immigration policy compared to elsewhere. However, some significant challenges. Scotland would need to keep its immigration policy very similar to the UK's if it was going to stay in the common travel area, which is its priority. We can see in the case of Ireland that its immigration policy isn't radically different to the UK's, and that's because it prioritises that free movement within the UK and Ireland. Scotland wouldn't have any influence over immigration inflows with the rest of the European Union, so that wouldn't be a particularly independent immigration policy in that sense. And finally, public hostility already is there, and it might increase with independence and higher inflows. Okay, and you can read more in our Centre for Population Change briefing papers and working papers, of which we have many. Thank you.